She stepped into the Quonset hut, expecting punishment. Her breath caught in her throat, the floor beneath her bare feet cool against the concrete. The air inside was thick with steam. Water hissed behind a canvas divider. The woman, once a Japanese army nurse stationed in the Philippines, stood frozen. This was the moment she'd feared, the humiliation, the degradation the Imperial Army had promised if captured. She gripped her ragged uniform tighter, heart pounding. Then the cowboy appeared, tall, wide-shouldered, with a drawl so slow it might have been a joke. He tipped his hat and nodded toward a makeshift pipe system strung together with American ingenuity and something close to kindness. "It ain't much," he said, "but it's hot." The steam smelled faintly of soap. Real soap. No barked orders, no leering eyes. Just a stranger offering a shower, a towel, and silence. And in that silence, everything she believed about the enemy began to unravel. Just the rattle of the truck and the scent of dust as it wound through the low hills of Guam. The girl gripped the metal bench with both hands, knuckles white beneath streaks of mud. Her uniform, once regulation nurse's khaki, was torn across the shoulder and stained from weeks of flight. Around her, other women sat hunched in silence, eyes locked forward, barely breathing. Not one of them spoke. They had all heard the same warnings, that surrender was not just defeat, but erasure. That an American prison would be a theater of shame. That once you were captured, you were no longer a daughter, a sister, a soldier. You were a dishonor in motion. The rumors came from all directions. Some had trickled through medical corridors during the final months of the campaign, whispers from medics, from junior officers, from other women with faces gone gray from what they had seen. There were stories of women in camps who had been branded, paraded, violated. No one ever verified these things. They didn't have to. In the old barracks outside Manila, a girl barely 18 had slit her wrists with a scalpel rather than be taken. They had found her on the tile floor, blood pooling in a quiet oval around her shoulder. The lesson was clear. Surrender was worse than death. It was the ultimate collapse. Now the nurse sat in that truck, 22 years old and certain she had already died in some way. Her eyes, once sharp, blinked slowly. She did not know what day it was. Her last meal had been a boiled egg 3 days before capture, shared with a wounded signal operator whose name she never learned. Her feet were blistered from marching barefoot after her shoes gave out on coral stone. She hadn't spoken in hours, maybe longer. When the truck lurched to a stop outside the compound, she felt the silence thicken. The gate swung open with a metallic clatter. What she expected was barking. Orders screamed in English, bayonets, rough hands, groping, mocking. Instead, a soldier stepped forward and made a gesture. It wasn't clear. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't pointing a rifle. He simply motioned toward the gate and nodded. Behind the fence, the camp looked plain, not cruel, not welcoming. Just wooden barracks and barbed wire, a water tower, a line of laundry fluttering in the breeze. She didn't know what to do with it. As the women filed out, she caught it, an aroma so strange and out of place it hit her like a slap. Bacon. She didn't know the word, but she knew the smell, rich, fatty, warm. It floated on the breeze like a hallucination. Her stomach knotted. Was it a trick? A trap to unsettle them? Food was supposed to be rationed, thin, cruel. Back in the jungle, they had fought over scraps. Here, the enemy made pork? She walked with the others toward intake. Not marched, not herded, just walked. Inside, the Americans asked for names, wrote things on clipboards, gave out blankets. The guards didn't leer. They barely looked up from their forms. One gave her a cup of water. Another gestured toward a bench. The nurse sat, expecting the blow to fall at any second. It never came. That night, she lay on a cot softer than anything she had slept on in months. Her hands trembled. She didn't understand what was happening. It felt like falling, but in the wrong direction. Not into punishment, but into something unfamiliar, quiet, almost kind. It wasn't mercy. It couldn't be. It was something worse. It was doubt. And Corporal Elijah McGraw knew exactly what it looked like. He'd seen it before in dying cattle, when the eyes went distant, not with pain, but with something more fatal, confusion. The body could endure hunger, thirst, even infection, but it was the disbelief that hollowed a creature out. That look haunted him now, as he stood leaning against a corrugated wall, chewing on a piece of straw, watching the line of Japanese women being processed into the camp. They moved like shadows, not prisoners, not soldiers, just ghosts in threadbare uniforms. He hadn't meant to end up here. The Army had wanted engineers, clerks, radio men. He was none of those. Just a ranch hand from Blanco County, Texas, the kind who fixed broken fences, patched leaking troughs, helped birth calves in the dead of winter. He didn't carry a rifle so much as babysit it. They gave him the rank of corporal, mostly because he'd managed not to shoot himself in training. But what he did know, better than anyone in that camp, was how to keep water flowing. The Quonset hut out back had been marked non-essential. No one wanted to go near it after the pipes burst and flooded half the interior with ankle-high rust water. The camp command said they'd wait for engineers, but engineers were busy with tanks and fuel depots. Fixing plumbing for female POWs didn't make the list. So the hut sat for weeks, humid and moldy, its broken pipes gurgling like a dying animal. Nobody cared, except Cowboy. The name wasn't official. He earned it the second week of arrival when he walked into the mess wearing a beat-up Stetson he'd brought from home, boots still dusted with Texas red clay. He called everyone partner, even the officers. His salute looked more like a tip of the hat. At first they tried to correct him. By the third week, they gave up. He was harmless, they said. Strange, but harmless. He noticed the women the moment they stepped off the trucks. They didn't flinch. They didn't blink. That scared him more than anything. He knew the look of something that had forgotten how to be alive. Their uniforms were crawling with lice. Some had blood crusted behind their ears. One woman's shoes had dissolved completely, her feet wrapped in gauze and twine. The medics did what they could, a few blankets, saline, typhus screenings, but no one talked about hygiene. No one even thought about it. Except Cowboy. He stood outside that busted Quonset one morning, a mug of coffee in hand, and watched the steam rise from the flooded floor. He didn't ask permission. He didn't file a requisition. He just walked to the scrapyard behind the motor pool, found the rusted remains of an old irrigation system, and started working. He spliced the copper tubing with a hacksaw he borrowed from the motor pool sergeant, bent the joints by hand, bolted the nozzles into the ceiling frame, and welded a bypass valve from a water tower tap. None of it looked pretty, but by the end of the week the hut hissed with the sound of water, hot water, the kind that steamed when it hit the concrete floor. He rigged a canvas divider for privacy, hammered hooks into the walls for towels, and strung a wire basket filled with soap. No one had told him to do it. No one had told him not to. So, when the first group of Japanese women were quietly escorted into the hut under the guise of medical sanitation, it was Cowboy who stood at the door. Not inside, not watching, just there to keep the peace. The women stepped into the steam as if it might burn them alive, but it didn't, and that was when he saw it again, that look in their eyes. Not fear, Not relief, just confusion. The war had taken everything from them, their country, their pride, their sense of safety. Now, here was a hut full of hot water and quiet. Cowboy didn't say much, just tipped his hat and muttered, "Ain't much, but it's warm." And somehow, in that moment, it was more than enough. The words floated behind them as they stepped into the steam. It hit her first, not the heat, not the smell of soap, but the silence, the kind of silence that didn't belong in war. The canvas curtain parted gently behind her, and the concrete beneath her bare feet was clean, almost smooth. She saw metal pipes overhead, strung together with wire and clamps that looked more like barn repairs than military design. And then the water, falling in thick, hissing ribbons from above. The nurse didn't move. Neither did the others. There were 6 women in that first group. None spoke. One stood frozen, her fingers clenched around the hem of her shirt, unable to bring herself to undress. The fear was that thick. Every nerve screamed that this was a trick, a humiliation, a trap. But it wasn't. They were alone. Cowboy stood outside. One of the guards, older, balding, uninterested, waited beyond the hut. Inside, there was only the warmth. The nurse was the first to move. She peeled off her uniform slowly, wincing as dried blood tugged at the fabric along her thigh. Her body, mottled with bruises and bug bites, flinched under the water at first, then stilled, then trembled. A sob caught in her throat. Another woman began to cry too, quiet, gasping sobs that echoed off the steel walls and mixed with the gurgle of the drain. Not from pain, not from shame, from something else, something closer to mourning. The soap was shaped like a rectangle, smooth and pale, with a lavender scent so delicate it reminded her of the temples back home. She hadn't smelled anything but sweat and gunpowder in weeks. She touched her shoulder with it, just once. And when the dirt slid off in streaks down her arm, her legs gave out. She sat on the floor, water raining down, the soap cradled in her lap like something holy. That was the first transformation. Not the food, not the blankets. This moment, inside a Quonset hut once filled with bullets and now filled with steam. They didn't speak after. Not at first. As they dried off, slipping into the plain cotton garments they had been given, something passed between them that had no language. They had not been stripped. They had not been mocked. The men had looked away. Cowboy hadn't even come inside. That night, the nurse couldn't sleep. She lay on her cot, staring at the rafters, her hair still damp and smelling faintly of lavender. She touched her skin, smooth again, clean. It didn't make sense. She remembered the warnings. That they would be violated, that the enemy would defile them as proof of victory, that American men were devils in uniform. But today, the devil had guarded the door and fixed the plumbing. And here's where you come in. These stories aren't in textbooks. They survive in moments like this, where a frightened nurse sat on a concrete floor, weeping under a shower rigged by a cowboy with a wrench. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop a comment below and tell us where you're tuning in from. It helps keep these memories alive, across borders, across time. And if this story moved you, even just a little, click that subscribe button just beneath this video. Then tap the bell icon next to it so you never miss the next chapter. Your support lets us keep sharing the human side of history, stories that nearly vanished. Because what happened in that hut didn't end with the water. The next day, the women returned, voluntarily. Not all at once and not without fear. But one by one they came. The steam, the soap, the silence. It was still there. Cowboy was too, standing outside with his hat low over his eyes. One of the younger women, barely more than a girl, smiled at him. He didn't smile back, but he nodded, and that was enough, but not for all of them. Not right away. The next morning, one of the older women refused to enter the hut. She stood at the edge of the doorway, arms folded, eyes sharp with the kind of suspicion that didn't need words. Another took the bar of lavender-scented soap and sniffed it as if it might be laced with something meant to strip her of more than dirt. She turned away and buried it in the red earth behind the barracks, patting the soil flat like a grave. A third stared at the towel she was given, then tore it in half before using it, convinced that anything given so freely had to be part of a trap. No one stopped them. The guards didn't interfere. Cowboy didn't lecture or explain. He just kept showing up, walking past with a roll of canvas under one arm, a coil of pipe slung over his shoulder, whistling a tune that none of the women recognized but couldn't stop hearing in their heads long after he was gone. At first, there was terror in the ordinary. Heat, privacy, respect. These were weapons in reverse. They had been trained to expect cruelty, to prepare for it like a second skin. What unnerved them was the absence of it. In the steaming walls of the shower hut, no one shouted. No one watched. The canvas curtain shielded them. The towels were thick. The soap lathered into soft foam that smelled of something impossibly gentle. And still, the air between them was heavy with disbelief. They had known cold and filth for so long that comfort felt like exposure. Some scrubbed themselves roughly, punishing their own skin for softening. Others washed in silence, eyes glassy, hands trembling. It was not trust. Not yet. It was disorientation. Cowboy returned day after day, never inside, always outside. When the hot water line hissed too loud, he fixed it. When a pipe leaked, he crouched beside it and muttered to himself while he tightened the joint. The women never thanked him, but they began to nod as they passed. Once, one of them left a folded paper crane on the stool where he kept his tools. He didn't ask who made it. He didn't move it either. Just let it sit there like a question with no need for an answer. They began speaking to one another again, slowly, as if words might shatter the spell. The nurse who had cried on the first day now asked the girl beside her if she'd ever used real soap before. Another confessed she'd forgotten what hot water felt like. One whispered, "If this is captivity, what was freedom?" The question hovered between them, fragile and terrifying. It wasn't just about showers or soap. It was about everything they had been taught, everything they had repeated like gospel, that the enemy would strip them of honor, that death was better than this. And yet here they were, alive, clean, and more confused than ever. Because it wasn't just the warmth that changed them. It was the permission to feel it. Even now, many could not bring themselves to smile. Some still eyed the guards with suspicion. Others hid the soap bars in their clothing in case the mercy vanished overnight. But the fear was softening, not gone, but fraying at the edges. And with it came something far more dangerous than terror, wonder. They began to wonder what else had been a lie. They began to wonder what it meant to matter, not as tools, not as symbols, but as women, as people. They had no name for it, no ceremony to mark the moment, but deep down they knew the shift had begun, and like the scent of lavender that lingered in their hair long after the water stopped, the questions would follow them, quietly, relentlessly, wherever the war went next. Weeks passed. The routine of the camp settled over them like a strange kind of rhythm. Morning roll call, meals in the mess hall, work assignments, showers at dusk. The fear didn't vanish, but it dulled into something quieter, like the ache of an old wound that no longer bled. One morning, as the sun burned pale over the compound, Cowboy approached the nurse with a pencil tucked behind his ear and a folded sheet of lined paper in his hand. He held it out awkwardly, as if the gesture itself might break a rule he hadn't read. "You can write home if you want," he said. His tone was casual, but his eyes were kind. She froze, staring at the paper as though it were a live thing. Home. The word struck like a blow. She hadn't thought of that place in months. Couldn't. The image of her mother bowing before an altar, her brother's photograph beside a bowl of rice, came to her in a rush so vivid she could smell the incense. But what could she say? That she was clean? That she wasn't starving? That the enemy gave her soap and towels and silence instead of torment? Her hands trembled as she took the paper. It felt wrong, too white, too perfect. The pencil was dull at the tip, and she clutched it like a blade. That night she sat on her cot under the dim yellow light of the barracks lamp, the paper spread across her knees. The others pretended not to watch, but they stole glances, their eyes drawn to the forbidden act. Writing home meant breaking the wall of the camp, touching a world that might no longer exist. For a long time she couldn't move her hand. The first stroke of the pencil felt like a betrayal, but eventually she began. "Mother, I am alive." She stopped. The pencil hovered. Her breath caught. The lie tasted strange on her tongue, not because it wasn't true, but because it was incomplete. Alive was not the same as free. Alive was not the same as unbroken. She continued hesitantly. "The Americans treat us humanely." The word felt too big, too foreign, like a pebble in her mouth. She scratched it out, then rewrote it. "We are fed, we work, we are allowed to bathe." She paused again. Should she tell the truth? That the showers were warm, that she had cried under them, that the man who built them had smiled like no soldier she'd ever seen? Or should she write what was expected, that they were punished, mocked, humiliated? Her pencil hesitated, trembling, and then she wrote what she could not say aloud. "There is a man who built a shower for us. He wears a hat like a storybook character. He does not look at us. I do not understand him." When she finished, she folded the paper carefully, smoothing the creases with her palms. She knew it would never reach Japan. Maybe it would be censored, maybe burned, maybe lost at sea. But that wasn't the point anymore. The letter wasn't meant for her mother. It was for her. A confession pressed into graphite and paper. A small rebellion against the silence the war had forced upon her. For the first time since her capture, she felt the weight inside her begin to shift. In the days that followed, others began to ask for paper too. Some wrote letters full of lies about bravery and resistance. Others wrote apologies to ghosts. One woman drew pictures instead, crude sketches of the hut, the showers, the faces of those around her. It wasn't communication. It was exorcism, a way to bleed without wounds. Cowboy collected the letters when they were done, tucking them into a canvas pouch marked "Mail Outgoing." He didn't read them, didn't ask questions. But as he walked away, the nurse noticed something she hadn't before. His shoulders looked heavier, as though he carried more than just paper. That night, as the lights dimmed and the camp sank into silence, she lay awake and whispered the words she couldn't write. "If the enemy can show mercy, what does that make us?" The question echoed in her mind long after sleep took her, heavy as the ocean between her and the home she no longer recognized. The next morning, she returned to the Quonset hut for her scheduled shower. It had become routine now, something expected, something navigated with silent efficiency. The other women no longer shuffled in like shadows. They walked. Cautiously, yes, but upright. Still no one laughed. Still no one smiled freely. But the silence that used to crackle with fear now felt more like reverence. That morning, as the nurse stepped inside the hut, she noticed something different. There, on the windowsill, just above the basket of fresh towels, sat a small paper crane. It was imperfect, creased unevenly, its wings not quite symmetrical, but delicate in a way that made her stop in place. The paper, she realized, was the wrapper from a Hershey's chocolate bar. The silver foil glinted faintly in the filtered light. It must have taken time, effort, and trembling fingers to fold something so fragile from a scrap meant to be discarded. She didn't touch it. She didn't need to. It wasn't hers, but it was meant to be seen. No one spoke of it. Not that day, not the next. But each time she came back, the crane was still there, undisturbed, upright, alone. Then one afternoon, there were two. Another day, a third appeared. None were the same. One had wings folded tight to its body. Another had a beak that drooped like it had grown weary mid-flight. The wrappers varied: chocolate, cigarettes, ration labels, bits of wax paper from the mess hall. Someone had even used the inside of a soap carton, the ink bleeding slightly into the folds. And still, no one spoke. The nurse added hers on the 5th day. She used the wrapping from a lemon drop Cowboy had handed her in passing. Tossed into her open palm like it meant nothing, she had saved it for no reason at all. Now, with trembling hands, she folded the paper on her cot that night, fumbling through the creases her mother had once taught her as a child. When she placed it on the sill the next morning, she did not look to see if anyone noticed. Something was happening, not loudly, not in protest, but in the quiet spaces the war had forgotten. These cranes were not prayers. They were memories in motion, of school days, of sisters, of ink-stained fingers and festivals under lantern light. They were not just made from paper. They were made from the ache of being seen again, from dignity returned in drips and fragments. A chocolate wrapper, a folded wing. The Quonset hut, once a symbol of rust and ruin, was becoming something else. A shrine, perhaps. A chapel without doctrine. The steam that filled the room felt different now. It clung not just to the women's skin, but to their silence, to the invisible thread stitching them back together. Each time someone added a crane, it was a refusal, a quiet defiance, a way of saying, "You didn't erase me." Cowboy never asked about the cranes, but he saw them. Once, while adjusting a valve near the doorway, he paused and looked toward the windowsill. He didn't speak, just tipped his hat slightly and went back to work. Maybe he understood, or maybe he didn't. It didn't matter. The cranes weren't for him. The women didn't know how many there were now. A dozen? More? Some had collapsed slightly in the damp air, wings sagging with the weight of humidity and time. But still they remained. No one dared move them. No one even brushed dust from their backs. They were too sacred for that. And for the nurse, the cranes became a kind of mirror, not of who she was in uniform or who she had been before the war, but of the pieces slowly returning. She wasn't whole, none of them were, but there, in that hut of steam and silence, folded in foil and placed beneath a narrow window, was proof that something soft still lived, that beauty could be rebuilt from trash, that humanity, when reclaimed, didn't need to shout. It only needed to sit quietly in the light, winged and waiting. But light doesn't always last. The steam still rose from the pipes, the cranes still perched on the windowsill, but something shifted the moment the summons came. One afternoon, Cowboy was called to the CO's office. The message arrived on a clipboard, passed along by a young recruit who mumbled his name and handed over the folded slip of paper like it was a death sentence. Cowboy didn't blink. He set down his wrench, dusted his palms on his trousers, and walked toward headquarters without saying a word. Inside, the mood was colder than usual. 3 officers sat behind a desk, none of them familiar. New men, the kind rotated in from stateside commands, still starched at the collar and uncomfortable in the Pacific heat. One of them leaned back and tapped the top of a manila file with one finger. "You've been busy," he said. "Very busy for a corporal." Cowboy didn't respond. He didn't need to. The accusations laid themselves out with bureaucratic precision. Unauthorized plumbing installations, unsanctioned entries into the women's quadrant, improper distribution of government-issued towels, deviation from standard maintenance duty. "You built a spa for the enemy," one of them said. His tone was not angry, just bewildered. Cowboy looked at the man, slow and level. He didn't fidget, he didn't apologize. He just let the silence stretch until it became heavy, then finally said, "When's the last time you saw someone cry over hot water?" No one answered. The officer's pen stopped moving. Another officer cleared his throat, muttered something about Geneva protocols and maintaining distance. Cowboy shrugged. "I never crossed the line," he said simply. "Just made the pipes work." He wasn't punished, not formally. There was no court-martial, no demotion. The officers signed off on the file, slid it into a drawer, and dismissed him with tight-lipped nods. But the message was clear enough. The hut could stay, the water could run. But Cowboy, he was not to go back. No more toolkits slung over his shoulder, no more towel refills, no more standing guard at the door like a sentry with a conscience. He was reassigned to the motor pool, tire rotations, brake checks, grease under the nails, and no more cranes. Word traveled fast through the camp, even without words. The next evening, when the nurse entered the hut, something felt wrong. The air was still warm, but the towels were damp, carelessly folded. One of the pipes dripped steadily, puddling against the floor. No one came to fix it. The women said nothing, but their silence sounded different now. It wasn't reverence, it was mourning. For Cowboy, the punishment wasn't the reassignment, it was exile. He had never asked for thanks, never lingered long enough to see the cranes multiply, but he had watched. And more than that, he had cared. In a place where caring was treated like contraband, that made him dangerous. Not because he broke rules, but because he reminded others that rules could be broken for the right reasons. Kindness had no paperwork, mercy had no official stamp. The crackdown was quiet, but complete. A new mechanic walked past the showers now, eyes forward, clipboard in hand, boots too clean. He didn't nod, he didn't whistle, he didn't fix the leak. The crane on the far left had started to sag, one wing drooping from the weight of moisture. No one touched it. The women didn't speak of Cowboy. They knew better, but each of them felt his absence like a tooth pulled from the jaw. No blood, no scar, just that haunting hollow where something used to live. And in the silence that followed, they learned something else, that mercy, when given without command, is its own kind of rebellion. And rebellions, in the eyes of war, were not to be rewarded, only tolerated, quietly watched, and, when necessary, silenced. The next day, the water was cold. Not lukewarm or inconsistent. Cold. Sharp as ice, biting as it hit their skin, cutting through the air that had once been thick with steam. The warmth they had come to expect, however cautiously, had vanished without explanation. The towel pile that Cowboy had kept stocked with quiet regularity was gone too. Just the hooks now, bare, empty, rusting a little at the ends. The windows had been shut, sealed with canvas flaps that dulled the light and held in nothing but stale air. The change was subtle only in detail. In feeling it was deafening. No one asked why. They already knew. Cowboy had disappeared like a ghost with a badge. No farewell, no wave, no return to the doorway of the Quonset hut. He had simply stopped coming. It wasn't that he had been reassigned. It was that something had been taken from them, quietly, with the same stealth that fear had once entered their bones. Only this time the absence was louder than presence. The women bathed in silence again. Not the wary, watchful silence of arrival, but the hollow kind, echoing through the rafters with every drip from the now leaking pipe no one came to fix. One of the paper cranes had collapsed, its wings damp and curling in on themselves. Another had been brushed from the sill during the cleaning rounds and crushed under a careless boot. It wasn't malice. It was neglect. But in a place where every detail had once been handled with such quiet care, neglect hurt worse. The nurse stood under the freezing water and didn't move. Her breath came in shallow bursts, her hands trembling not from cold, but from something deeper. She remembered the first shower, the fear, the sobs, the disbelief. She remembered Cowboy at the door, boots planted like roots, humming a tune no one recognized. And now she realized it had not been the heat that made her feel human again. It was the choice. The dignity of comfort offered freely, not enforced, and now even that had been revoked. Some women stopped coming altogether. They washed at the outdoor basin instead, using rainwater and rough cloth. Others returned to the hut out of habit, not hope. The lavender soap was still there, though its scent had faded. One woman sniffed it and muttered, "It smells like nothing now." The words fell into the damp air and dissolved. And yet they noticed each other more now. A hand steadied another on the slick floor. A folded rag was passed between cots. A crane, fresh and bright, appeared again on the sill, this one made from the corner of a Red Cross flyer. No one acknowledged it, but the others began folding too, not as tribute to Cowboy, not directly, but as resistance, quiet, careful, persistent resistance against the cold. Because in the void he left behind, the lesson remained, that kindness, once given, cannot be taken back. It lingers. It roots in places even war cannot reach. The cold water only reminded them of what they had once been given and how cruel it felt to lose it, not because they needed it to survive, but because they had already tasted the kind of warmth that made survival feel like something more. So they bathed, quietly, carefully, together. And in the hush of their routine, the grief became a ritual of its own, a way of remembering that even in a place built to strip them down, something had managed to reach in and make them feel whole, if only for a little while. Now, with every cold drop, they remembered, and remembering somehow, kept the warmth alive. The day of departure arrived with no ceremony. A list was posted outside the mess tent, typed in faint ink and pinned beneath a rusted horseshoe nail. The nurse's name was on it. She stared at it for a long time before folding the page and tucking it into her uniform pocket. The others said nothing. There was no celebrating. Release did not feel like freedom. It felt like walking out of one kind of silence and into another. When the trucks came to take them to the port, she packed lightly. She carried no souvenirs, only a letter she had never mailed and a bar of chocolate Cowboy had handed her weeks ago, now melted slightly at the corners. The ship that took them across the Pacific was gray, loud, and crowded. They slept in bunks stacked like crates. At night, the nurse sat alone on the deck, watching the ocean stretch into a horizon that refused to remember her. She kept the chocolate hidden inside her blouse. She didn't eat it. She wasn't hungry. She just needed to know it was there. Something that had once meant kindness in a world that had tried so hard to erase it. When she stepped onto the pier in Yokohama, the first thing she noticed was the quiet. Not the kind she had known in camp, thick with emotion, but an emptier silence, one hollowed out by firebombs and defeat. The city was unrecognizable, roads cracked and sagging, buildings scorched to their bones, children with eyes too old for their faces. Her uniform marked her as something strange, not quite soldier, not quite civilian, a ghost of the war returned to a homeland that no longer knew what to do with her. Her family met her at the station. Her mother wept, but not from joy. Her father didn't speak. Her brother, now just a photo on the altar, stared back at her as if waiting to be explained. She told them nothing. How could she? That she had lived because the enemy had given her soap? That her captor had fixed a broken pipe so she could shower in peace? That the man she feared most had guarded a door so she wouldn't be seen? No. There were no words for that in the language they still spoke. At night, she lay awake, listening to the walls shift in the wind. Her mother prayed in the next room. Her father smoked in silence. She didn't cry. She couldn't. Until one evening she set a small kettle on the charcoal stove. It was cold. She waited as the flames licked the metal, her hands wrapped around her knees. And then, as the steam finally began to rise, soft, slow, curling into the air, she broke. Not with a sound, but with a stillness so complete it felt like collapse. She pressed her face into her hands and let the warmth wash over her again. Not from water, from memory. She saw the Quonset hut, the towel hooks, the dripping pipe, the crane on the sill, and Cowboy, just outside the door, hat tilted low, humming that strange American tune. She wept not for what she had lost, but for what she had been allowed to know, that mercy existed, that the enemy could be human, that dignity could bloom in the most unexpected soil. She never told anyone, not really, but every time she boiled water, every time the steam rose, she paused, just for a second, eyes closed, remembering. And in that pause, halfway across the world from a camp no one believed could be kind, she carried something no one could take from her, not shame, not pride. Just warmth, and the knowledge that once, behind enemy lines, she had been seen. Years later, long after the war had become something talked about in quiet tones and history books, she sat at the edge of her daughter's futon, braiding her hair with fingers that had once shaken from hunger. The girl was curious, like all children are, asking what the war had been like, whether the bombs were loud, whether she had been afraid, whether the Americans were as cruel as the old stories said. The nurse, now a mother, now older than she ever expected to live, paused. She didn't talk about battles, or marching, or the smell of fire. She didn't mention how many had died, or what she had seen. Instead, she spoke softly of a shower, of steam curling from rusted pipes, of a cowboy who stood at the door with his hat low and his voice steady, of soap that smelled faintly of flowers, of the cranes on the window-sill. Her daughter blinked in confusion, expecting stories of victory or terror, not warmth. But she listened, and the nurse told her what the water had meant, how it had softened something inside her that even survival had not. How it had carved space into her fear, not because it was hot or because it was clean, but because it was given freely, without demand or condition. That, she said, was the first time the war didn't make sense anymore. The girl asked why, and the mother hesitated. How could she explain that the enemy, who had every reason to be cruel, had chosen to be kind? That a man with no orders and no obligation had used his hands to build something that allowed women like her to be human again, even if just for 10 minutes a day? She tried to explain. That mercy, when it appears in the midst of war, does not just confuse, it shatters the story you've been told about who you are and who you must hate. That dignity, once returned, leaves a wound when it is taken away again, a quiet, permanent one. Her daughter nodded slowly, the way children do when they sense they are being given something fragile. Later, she would tell her friends that her mother had survived the camps, but privately, she remembered the crane, the one her mother still kept, tucked in a box with brittle letters and old ration stamps. A silver crane, creased and faded, its wings slightly uneven. The girl had held it once, and her mother had told her, that one was folded from chocolate. She had laughed, but the mother hadn't smiled. She had only said, it was the only sweet thing we had. Over time, the mother's voice grew weaker, the memories sharper. But whenever steam rose in their home, from soup, from tea, from boiling rice, the mother would always go still, her eyes tracing the air, and the girl, grown now, would watch her and know she was remembering warmth that had nothing to do with temperature, remembering how a stranger's choice to care had altered something permanent inside her, and that, above all, had survived, because war is remembered in dates and losses. But sometimes it survived in moments that don't fit the narrative. A shower, a nod, a piece of soap, and years later, those moments don't fade. They shine brighter than medals, because they ask the hardest question of all, what if kindness was the braver act? And in one mother's story, told in the hush of bedtime, a truth the world still struggles to hold found its place, not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet rise of steam,